Don't ask her anything important. She wouldn't understand it anyway. My mother said it without lowering her voice. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "She's always been better at following instructions than thinking for herself." A few people laughed softly. One of my relatives nodded like it confirmed something they had already assumed. My father didn't correct her. He didn't look at me either. Instead, he said to the group near him, "We keep her away from decisions. It's simpler that way." The sentence settled into the room more firmly than the first. No one questioned it. No one asked if it was accurate. It was accepted as context. It was their anniversary dinner. The room was arranged carefully, tables aligned, lights warm, everything structured to look intentional. I was standing near the side table, holding a tray I hadn't been assigned but had picked up because it needed to be carried. Someone reached past me to take a glass. Another asked if there were more plates in the kitchen. No one acknowledged what had just been said. The meaning stayed where it had been placed. Clear. Simple. Final. I nodded when someone spoke to me, moved when something needed to be moved, and continued doing what I had already been doing. They didn't seem to be a reason to respond. That's when I understood something had shifted. It wasn't the first time something like that had been said. It was just the first time it had been said so clearly, in front of people who didn't know me well enough to question it. If you've ever been in a place where you were useful but not really seen, you probably recognize the feeling. Not ignored exactly. Just defined in a way that limits what others expect from you. If you've ever experienced that, you can subscribe. Not because this is dramatic, but because it's familiar. Have you ever noticed how people decide your value long before they understand your role? In my family, roles were established early and rarely questioned. My older sister was considered capable in visible ways. She spoke confidently, made decisions quickly, and was comfortable being the center of attention. My parents trusted her in situations that involved presentation, negotiation, and anything that required direct interaction with others. I was different. I was the one who followed instructions, completed tasks, and avoided unnecessary conflict. I was described as reliable, which sounded like a compliment but usually meant I was expected to adapt without resistance. When I was younger, this distinction seemed harmless. I remember being 12 and organizing documents for a small family issue involving land records. No one asked me to do it, but I noticed the papers were out of order and spent an afternoon arranging them chronologically. When my father found them later, he used them in a meeting. He didn't mention who had organized them. At 15, during a wedding in the extended family, I spent most of the event coordinating small things, making sure vendors were paid, confirming timings, handling calls when something changed. My sister was on stage for most of the evening. People complimented her presence. At 18, when there was a disagreement about finances between two relatives, I was asked to look into it. I reviewed messages, compared numbers, and explained the discrepancy quietly to my parents. The issue was resolved. Later, I heard it described as something my father had handled. These moments repeated in different forms over the years. I wasn't excluded. I was included in a specific way. I had access, but not recognition. I was trusted to execute, not to represent. And over time, that pattern became stable enough that no one felt the need to question it, including me. By the time I was in my early 20s, I had become involved in most of the family's operational matters without it ever being formally acknowledged. I handled documentation for property agreements. I maintained digital copies of records that were originally scattered across different places. I kept track of deadlines related to filings and renewals. When something needed to be submitted, I made sure it was submitted correctly. When something needed to be verified, I checked it against previous records. If there was confusion, I clarified it. It wasn't described as responsibility. It was described as helping. I didn't disagree with that description. At the time, it seemed accurate. I wasn't making decisions independently. I was organizing, confirming, and ensuring that things moved without interruption. But access comes with a certain kind of visibility. I knew where documents were stored. I knew which versions had been signed and which ones hadn't. I knew what had been communicated formally and what had only been discussed informally. None of this felt like control. It felt like awareness. And awareness didn't require acknowledgement. Not reacting wasn't something I decided in a single moment. It developed gradually. There were times when I considered correcting things, clarifying roles, pointing out inconsistencies in how contributions were described. But each time I thought about it, the outcome seemed predictable. If I reacted, it would be interpreted as oversensitivity. If I insisted, it would be framed as unnecessary conflict. And if I tried to redefine my role directly, it would likely be dismissed as misunderstanding. Remaining quiet, on the other hand, allowed something else. It maintained proximity. It preserved access. It kept me in a position where I could observe without interruption. Arrogance makes people sloppy. And over time, I started to notice patterns that wouldn't have been visible if I had stepped away earlier. A week after the anniversary, there was a smaller gathering at home. A few relatives had stayed back in the city, and my parents hosted a dinner for them. The atmosphere was more relaxed. There were fewer people, fewer formalities. At some point during the evening, the conversation shifted to financial planning. One of my relatives asked about a recent property transaction that had been mentioned casually during the anniversary. My father began explaining the structure of the deal. He spoke about ownership distribution, timelines, and expected returns. I recognized the details immediately. I had organized most of the documentation for that transaction. As he spoke, there was a small inconsistency in how he described one of the agreements. I didn't interrupt. When he finished, the same relative turned to me and asked, "You must be aware of this, right? You help with these things." Before I could respond, my mother answered for me. "She doesn't really understand the bigger picture. She just follows instructions. It's easier that way." There was a pause. Not a long one, but noticeable. Someone nodded. The conversation moved on. I didn't correct her. Later that evening, I was asked to bring out additional documents so my father could show something more specific. I did exactly what was asked. They didn't realize what they had just handed me. After that evening, I didn't change anything visibly. I continued doing what I had been doing, but I became more structured about it. I created a separate folder on my laptop, labeled in a way that wouldn't attract attention. Inside it, I organized copies of documents based on categories: property agreements, financial statements, communication records. I backed up the folder onto an encrypted drive. The drive was small, easy to store, and not something anyone else had reason to access. Whenever I handled a document, I kept a copy. Whenever there was a conversation that involved decisions, I summarized it in a private note. If something was communicated over email, I archived the thread. If something was discussed verbally and later formalized, I compared the two versions. Over time, patterns became clearer. Dates didn't always align. Descriptions changed slightly depending on the audience. Some agreements referenced terms that weren't reflected in the final documents. None of this was immediately significant on its own. But taken together, it created a record that was more complete than any single version presented publicly. I also reviewed my own position within these structures. In a few cases, my name appeared in places I hadn't paid much attention to before: co-signatory on certain filings, authorized contact for specific accounts, secondary approval on documentation that required verification. These weren't roles that had been explained to me in detail. They had been assigned gradually, as part of the same pattern of helping. I didn't question them at the time. I documented them now. Preparation replaced reaction. A few months later, my father asked me to review a new set of documents. He said it was a routine update related to one of the properties. When I looked at the papers, I noticed that it involved a transfer of certain rights that had previously been distributed differently. My role in the document was clearly defined. I was required to sign as an approving party. Without that signature, the document wouldn't be valid. My mother explained it briefly. "It's just a formality. We've already discussed everything. You just need to sign so we can move forward." The assumption was clear. Compliance was expected. There was no detailed explanation. No discussion of implications. Just a request framed as routine. I nodded. I told them I would review it and sign it. I didn't raise any concerns. I didn't ask any questions. That agreement activated everything I had been organizing quietly. I didn't confront them directly. Instead, I responded through the same channels they were using. I sent an email. In it, I referenced the document they had asked me to sign. I attached a set of supporting files. Each file was labeled clearly: previous agreements, archived communications, verified copies of filings that showed how certain terms had been represented at different points. I also included a brief note. I explained that before signing, I needed clarification on specific discrepancies between the current document and earlier versions. I listed those discrepancies, factually, without interpretation. At the end of the email, I mentioned that, as an authorized signatory, I was required to ensure that all documentation was consistent and accurate before providing approval. There was no accusation, no suggestion of wrongdoing, just a request for clarification, supported by records. The structure spoke for itself. The response didn't come immediately. For a day, nothing happened. Then the calls started. Not to me at first. To my father. Then to my mother. The tone of the house changed quickly. Conversations became shorter. Doors stayed closed longer. There were more phone calls than usual, many of them taken in private. A few days later, an official letter arrived. It referenced the same documents I had mentioned. It requested clarification on specific points before further processing could continue. After that, more communication followed. Requests for additional documentation. Verification of certain claims. Temporary holds on actions that had been assumed to be straightforward. Accounts that were expected to move forward remained unchanged. Processes that were considered routine became conditional. I wasn't directly involved in most of these exchanges, but I could observe the effects. My parents were no longer speaking about the situation with the same certainty. There was confusion, then denial, then a quieter kind of urgency. At one point, my father asked me if I had shared information with anyone. I told him I had responded to the document as required. Nothing more. He didn't press further. Over time, the volume of activity decreased. Not because everything was resolved, but because the process had shifted into a different phase, one that required formal resolution rather than informal assumptions. I didn't intervene. I didn't offer explanations. I continued with my own work. The system was handling the rest. A few weeks later, I packed my things. There wasn't much to organize. Most of what I needed was already separate. On the last day, I walked through the house once, not to revisit anything, but to confirm that I hadn't left anything behind. My parents were in another room. We didn't have a final conversation. There didn't seem to be a reason for one. Near the entrance, there was a small table where keys were usually kept. I placed my set there. Not abruptly, just in the same way they had always been placed. Then I stepped outside, closed the door, and left. Distance didn't change what had happened. It changed how clearly I could see it. For a long time, I had assumed that roles were stable because they were accurate. That if something was repeated often enough, it reflected reality. But repetition can also create its own version of truth. One that isn't questioned because it's convenient. Looking back, nothing that happened was sudden. The patterns were consistent. The signals were visible. I had just chosen not to interpret them in a way that required action. Until it became necessary. Respect, I realized, isn't always withheld intentionally. Sometimes it's simply never assigned. And once a role is defined without it, changing that definition directly can be difficult. Not impossible, but inefficient. There are other ways to adjust structure. Ways that don't rely on explanation. Or agreement. Just clarity. I don't think about the outcome in terms of loss or gain. It was an adjustment. A correction in how things were aligned. I didn't need them to understand it. I just needed to stop participating in a version of the system that required me to be smaller than I was. That was enough. And it was final.